So I want to introduce our next panel. As I mentioned this morning, we're going to have a great discussion of a couple panels talking specifically about revenue sources. This first panel will examine the central question, can cities raise taxes? And talk about when and under what circumstances constituents are willing to pay for what their cities need. So we're welcoming to the panel discussion here Alan Feld, who will be moderating. Alan is professor from the Boston University School of Law, an expert in tax and corporate law. He's the co-author of a major tax casebook and been published in the nation's leading tax journals. Welcome, Professor Feld. Joining him is Vladimir Kogan, assistant professor of political science at Ohio State University, who's published on tax and fiscal policy, including a recent book on the fiscal crisis in San Diego. Next to Vlad is Enid Slack, director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Thank you, Enid. Justin Balick, manager of public policy and government affairs at A Better City. This is a nonprofit focused on transportation, public development, and infrastructure investment. And also Mayor Kim Driscoll, mayor of Salem, Massachusetts, elected in 2006 as the city's first female mayor. Mayor Driscoll has stabilized the city's finances, turning a multi-million-dollar budget deficit into a balanced budget. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. Our topic is, can cities raise taxes? And for most cities, that means, what can we do with the real property tax? The real property tax, in theory, is very simple. It has a base, the value of the land, and a rate. There's not much you can do with the base, especially since it keeps getting eroded or limited by powers above the city. The rate is where the action usually takes place. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister for Louis XIV, is credited with defining taxation as consisting in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest amount of feathers with the least possible amount of hissing. Well, constituents are not geese, but they can do a fair amount of hissing. And our panel will explore the possibilities for raising additional revenue from urban residents without too much hissing. Often the largest part of the urban budget goes to education. Dr. Kogan examines voter decisions in the context of proposed tax increases on school budgets, and his observations, I think, will give us some room for limited optimism. Dr. Slack will analyze constituent attitudes toward increases in the property tax. And the property tax engenders reactions which are more complicated than a simple reluctance to pay more. It has all sorts of emotional and other meanings for residents. And Dr. Slack will explore some of the nuances connected with property tax. Justin Balin will add paying for infrastructure to our mix, particularly transportation and transit. These projects are never self-supporting, and so raise again the question of how much localities can afford to pay for them. And finally, we're going to have Mayor Kim Driscoll, who will report from the trenches as someone who has had to balance fiscal considerations in both day-to-day planning and in long-range planning as well. So we'll begin with Dr. Kogan.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to present to you some empirical evidence from some work that I've done with colleagues at Ohio State, looking at the question of voter behavior and voter attitudes towards tax increases and the consequences of those attitudes. Okay, so we talked a little bit yesterday, you heard a little bit yesterday from the National League of Cities about tax and expenditure limits. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those today, except to say that they're common and they apply in almost every state. So once we go beyond cities and look at local governments more general, there's actually only 4 states that don't have some sort of tax and expenditure limitation on the books. And so these work in a variety of ways. They limit how much taxes can increase. They limit how quickly property can be reassessed. Here in Massachusetts, I think all of you live under a tax and expenditure limit, Proposition 2.5. But I think what's common, there's a lot of variation across states, but the one thing that's common in almost every state is that these TELs provide for a voter override. So there's some limit, but we can exceed the limit if voters say yes. So that's why I want to focus on voters and the decisions that they make at the ballot box when they're voting on these kinds of overrides. And the question I really want to focus on is, how do voters make these decisions? Do they kind of act rationally? Do they make really smart cost-benefit calculations? And if you've talked to a lot of voters, as I do regularly, and you ask them what government spends money on, they'll tell you that the largest category of expenditures in almost any public agency, whether city or state, is the Department of Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. And if you ask them to raise taxes, the first thing they'll tell you is, why should we increase taxes when we can just cut the Department of Waste, Fraud, and Abuse? And so the best example I have of this is from California. So California, like many other states, was hit hard by the recession and had a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. In fact, it was in the tens of billions of dollars. So the Field Poll, which is a national, or a state polling organization, did a survey in 2009 in which it asked voters, the state government has been facing a large budget deficit over the past several years. Some people believe that by simply eliminating waste and inefficiencies, our state government can provide roughly the same level of services that it currently does, even if this budget was cut by $20 to $25 billion. Do you agree with this view? And to give you a sense, in 2009, the state budget was about $90 billion. So we're asking voters, can we cut a quarter out of the state budget without basically affecting service levels? And I know this is being webcast, but I'll go on a limb and say that if you believe this, you're crazy. There's certainly efficiencies to be made, but there's absolutely no way you can cut a quarter of the budget and not have service impacts. Yet when we asked voters, when the Field Poll asked voters in California, 57% said yes. We can cut a quarter of the budget with no service impacts. And this wasn't just conservative Republicans. In fact, almost half of the Democrats said yes. And this is crazy California. So if you go to places like Michigan or go to places like Alabama, you can imagine what public opinion would look like there. So this is going to have some important consequences. And I hope during the Q&A we can talk about where these perceptions come from. I have some pretty strong ideas. But today what I want to focus on is, what are the consequences of these perceptions on the decisions that voters make on Election Day? How do they decide whether to vote yes or no, given their beliefs about the consequences? How do people that run government agencies respond to these decisions? What happens when voters say no? Do they make cuts, and if so, what services do they cut? And long term, what are the political implications of those cuts? And I'm going to apply it in a very particular case of education financing, of how voters behave when they're voting on tax referenda to fund local education. And I think education is really a useful way to think about this question for 3 reasons. If we think of all the public services out there, education is actually the most popular. If you ask, what are you willing to pay taxes for, right? Education is a service that ranks the highest. On the other hand, it's also in some ways the one that's easiest to cut. We have a lot of evidence from education economists that really shows there's no clear relationship between the quality of the education that students get and the amount of spending that's actually spent on it. So if there are areas that we can cut without consequences, it's probably education. And third, education is also the one area where we actually have really good data. We test students every year, and we can measure the consequences of decisions on service levels and service outcomes with a lot of precision. So I'm going to show you some evidence from Ohio. And Ohio is a great state to do this because it has a really strict tax and expenditure limit. If you're a school district, your revenues cannot increase at all, even if property values go up, even if there's inflation. They cannot increase at all unless voters vote for an override to allow a new tax increase. So we have data on about 3,000 of these votes. And we have data on individual student achievement, so student level data, which allows us to take out things like socioeconomic status and isolate the effect of school quality on student achievement. And I want to connect these two and see what happens when voters say no at the ballot box to what happens to students in the classroom. Now, this is actually an interesting question, because even though I told you education is the most popular service out there, if you look at the percent voting yes on these tax referenda, and you need 50% to pass, almost half of these school levies fail in Ohio, almost half. And so we want to see what the consequences of that is. And in some ways, that's actually a really difficult question, because voters saying no can have effect on service levels, but we also know that service levels are also probably going to affect whether voters say yes or no. Right? If service quality is declining, then that might have an effect on what voters do on election day. So this is a really challenging question to look at. And we're going to use a clever design. We're going to exploit the fact that whether a tax passes or not is determined by the exact vote that it gets, 50%. So at 50% plus 1, it passes. At 49.99, it fails. And once we get really, really close, once we look only at school districts where the levy barely passes to where it barely fails, we're really kind of in a world where the election is a coin flip, right? It rains that day, and maybe 2 voters stay home. So it's an election that's decided almost by chance. Now, that's really bad for democracy, right? We don't want decisions being made by chance. That's really good for us because it's really like a randomized experiment, right? Whether a levy fails or passes is decided by chance, and those districts are going to be exactly the same in all sorts of ways. So I'm going to show you the evidence of what happens when a school tax passes versus when it fails. And all the pictures I'm going to show you are going to look just like this. So on the y-axis, you can think of this as the difference between the average school district where a levy passes and where it fails. And on the x-axis, this is the years after the levy appeared on the ballot. So this is year 1 to year 6. These points are kind of our best guess at the effect, and these lines are our confidence interval. So if you know margins of error in surveys, this is like our margin of error. We think this is our best guess, but it could be somewhere in that range. And so what you see is that after a levy fails, there is a negative effect, and it's equal to about 5% of average spending in a school district. But what I want to highlight to you is that the effect only persists for 2 years. I'm going to come back in a few minutes to focus really on this. Right? There is a negative effect on schools' funding, but only for the first 2 years. What do school districts cut when their tax increases fail? When we look at things like busing, when we look at things like basic maintenance and repairs of leaky roofs, those things get cut a lot, and they get cut over many years. We look at instructional expenditures, spending on teachers in the classroom, probably the most important function of these schools. They're also lower. We look at pupil support expenditures, things like investment in dropout prevention specialists, investment in school counselors. Again, we see cuts, and they persist over a long time, even though revenues recover after 2 years. And in percentage terms, these are really big cuts. This is the area that gets cut the most. What do school districts not cut? Well, if you look at administrative expenses, there's absolutely no decrease. If you look at staff development expenses, there's absolutely no difference. Now, why is this? So we've talked to a lot of school board members, and some of them say this is just reality. It's a lot easier to cut busing, to not repair a leaky roof, or to not replace teachers as they retire and have slightly smaller class sizes than it is to lay off principals and not have principals at your schools, or not have a superintendent in the central office. But I told you, so what are the consequences of this for student achievement? So we have student-level data. We can see what are the effects of these cuts on student learning in the classroom. And you see, especially in year 2 and 3 after these taxes fail, there are impacts. And to give you a sense of these effects in more intuitive terms, this is about 3 weeks of learning. So when a school tax fails, students enrolled in those schools 2 years later learn about 3 weeks less in year 2, and again 3 years less in year 3. And this is a change. This is how much students are learning. So even though we get back to 0 by year 4, all this means is that these schools are no longer falling behind. Right? They never make up the decrease in achievement that they see. Now, why do we see the effects only in years 2 and 3? why do we see the revenue effects only in the first 2 years? Well, if we look at the probability of passing another school levy, it is actually much higher in school districts where the levy initially fails. So voters say no, cuts happen, they observe the consequences of these cuts on student learning, on the number of teachers, and a few years later, when they have another chance, they say yes, right? They increase the taxes that they initially said no to. And so I want to conclude with kind of the big takeaway, I think, that we can apply not only to education politics, but to local politics. I think that we can safely say that voters are not very good at figuring out, right, how much can be cut without really hurting service levels. And they're going to say no, even when sometimes they really should say yes. But I think the good news is that they can learn, right? They can observe the consequences of their decisions. They can see the impact on service quality. And as a result, change their mind if they're given a chance to. And the best way to do that is to really make it painful, right? Cut the things that voters value the most, which I think is, I'm going to conclude with my maybe the most controversial point. This is in some ways maybe a good message or a positive message for democracy. But for all of those of you who are elected officials, I think this is also in some ways very troubling news, because it means that the interests of your cities and the interests of the jurisdictions that you represent are in some ways very much in conflict with your personal political interests. Because if you want to do what's in the interest of your city when voters say no, you should cut the services that voters value the most to change their mind. But if you want to get reelected, or if you want to run for higher office, right, that's probably the last thing that you want to do. So in some ways, your personal political priorities are going to be very much not the same as the priorities and the interests of the cities that you represent. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Graham and Catherine for inviting me to this conference. At the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, we spend a lot of time talking about the fiscal health of cities and city regions around the world, and so this has been a really interesting conference. One quick plug, just earlier this week we released a new book called Is Your City Healthy? Measuring Urban Fiscal Health, which is an edited volume looking at cities in Canada, the United States, OECD countries, and some other general articles about how do you measure fiscal health. But today I'm talking about can cities raise property taxes? The short answer to that question is probably not very easily. In a question that I posed to Mayor Slogan yesterday about increasing taxes, he said, yes, I would consider income and sales, but the last thing I want to do is increase the property tax. So it's going to be difficult. What I'd like to do is three things. Firstly, I'd like to talk about what's good about the property tax. Economists always say the property tax is the best tax for local governments. Why do they say that? The second thing I'd like to do is talk about why in practice the property tax is a very difficult tax to increase. What is it about the property tax? Now, of course, it's difficult to increase when you have Proposition 2.5 or Proposition 13, but why do we even have those propositions? Why are we putting caps on the amount we can raise the property tax? And that's going to be kind of a negative discussion, and I know this is supposed to be a positive day. We're supposed to come up with solutions. So the third thing I'd like to do is talk about what can be done to make the property tax more popular so that we can raise it. So let me start with the first question. Why do economists think the property tax is a good tax for local governments? Well, there are three main reasons. First, property is immovable. If you tax property, it can't pick up and move to another jurisdiction the way people can. So you have a captive tax base. It's difficult to avoid the tax. So just from a pure administrative point of view, it's an easy tax to collect. Economists like the property tax in particular for its efficiency properties. It's a much less distortionary tax than other taxes. In other words, it doesn't affect people's behavior as much as other taxes do. And that's because, to a large extent, changes in property tax are capitalized into the value of the property. So if you increase property taxes, that will affect your property value. So to a large extent, it is less distortionary than income or sales taxes. It doesn't affect decisions such as how much labor am I going to supply, how much am I going to invest in human capital, how much are companies going to innovate. These are not decisions that are affected by the property tax, but they are affected by other taxes. So again, economists like it because it's more efficient. And lastly, there's a relationship between the property taxes you pay and the benefits you receive from local services. Whether it's street lighting or parks or sidewalks, those are reflected in your property values. If you live near a transit station, not too near, but close to a transit station, that will be reflected in your property value. So there is this link between the benefits from local public services and the taxes you pay. More so for residential property than business properties, but there's still that link. And that fosters local autonomy and accountability because people know what they're getting and can talk to their local governments about it. So that's why economists like the property tax. But obviously economists don't know everything because it's very difficult, we hear, to increase the property tax. And I'm going to list 6 reasons or 6 obstacles to increasing the property tax. The first one, and I think perhaps the most important one, is the visibility, or we call it the salience, of the property tax. So for most people, income taxes are withheld at source. Not if you're self-employed, but if you are not self-employed, your income taxes are taken off your check even before you get the money to take home. And if you ask people what they paid in income taxes last year, they often don't know. They may know what refund they got in April, they may know how much more they paid, but they often don't know what they paid in income taxes. When it comes to the sales tax, we know we pay, 2.795% or whatever it is here in Massachusetts. We know what we pay on each item, but nobody over the course of the year adds up what they paid in sales taxes. Nobody knows that. But you ask people what they paid in property taxes last year, $4,579.12. People know that. They know it because they get a bill once a year, twice a year, 6 times a year, and it's money that they've had that they now have to put out and pay to the local government. It's a very visible tax. Well, as an economist, I say that's good. That makes local governments accountable. When people know what they're paying in taxes, and we're financing services that are very visible, this is accountability. This is good local government. But boy, as a politician, I am sure it is very hard to raise that tax when people now know it's $4,600.29. So that's one of the first problems. The second is there are often liquidity problems for some taxpayers. How often do we hear about the little old lady, and I do property tax work around the world, and I hear this in every country. Little old lady bought her house for $50,000 30 years ago. It's now worth $2 million, and she can't afford the property taxes. Nobody ever talks about the capital gain that she's going to get when she sells that house. But this is a true political problem, and we don't want to send little old ladies out of their houses. There are ways of dealing with that through tax deferrals, but people still, bring up that little old lady whose property value has gone up and she can't afford the taxes. The third problem is the perceived, and I underline perceived regressivity of the property tax. A lot of people think it's a regressive tax. Andy Rashofsky talked about it yesterday. He said, the literature is really going the other way on that. It's not that clear that it is as regressive as people thought. And even if it is, there are programs, he talked about circuit breakers, that relate the property taxes to your income, and so that low-income taxpayers get relief. A fourth problem with the property tax is it's what we call a presumptive tax. So when you file your income tax return, you have your income, you put it down, and you have your slips to get to verify it. But how do we value the property tax base? Well, it's a market value. It's usually defined as something like the price that would be struck between a willing buyer and a willing seller in an arm's length transaction. Well, that's fine if my house sold today on valuation day. But what if my house hasn't sold for 50 years? How do we know the value? So it's an estimate. So that's why we call it a presumptive tax. We have to estimate the value. And that leads to a lot of problems with people saying, well, that's not the value of my property. How did you get that value? Because we are estimating. A fifth problem with the property tax is there's a lot of confusion and distrust about the rate setting procedure and the actual estimate of the property tax base. People look at a tax bill, and I know Alan said it's a simple tax rate times a tax base, but you know that's not true. When you have a proposition that's limiting things, when you have all kinds of things going on, if you have you're in a city where they have revenue neutrality, in other words, if assessment goes up 25%, the tax rate has to come down by 25%, so that the assessment increase is revenue neutral. Well, if my property goes up by more than 25%, well, my taxes are going to go up. But if my property goes up by less than 25%, my taxes are going to go down. On and on and on, it gets more and more confusing. So people distrust it because they don't understand. It's not a simple tax rate times a tax base. And so it's confusing. And the last obstacle has to do with the potential volatility of the property tax. The property tax can go up and down because I could be living in a neighborhood that suddenly becomes hot. I haven't done anything. I've just lived in the same place, and suddenly everybody wants to live in my neighborhood. Property values go up, taxes go up. Next year, it's another neighborhood that's hot, so maybe my taxes go down. So it's not, people love stability and predictability, but often with the property tax, there's volatility. So for those 6 reasons, and mostly I think the visibility, it can be very difficult to increase the property tax. Well, I said I'd try to end on a more positive note. And what can be done? And I think, and we're hearing this over the course of yesterday and again this morning, that if we link the property tax to broader reforms in public sector management that improve services and improve governance, we will be giving taxpayers something that they want. So whenever we can link the taxes we're raising with what we're giving people, I think they're more, never happy, but happier to pay that tax. And the ballot initiatives that we've been talking about are an example of that. We're raising the tax by a certain percentage to provide transit in your community, something people can relate to. It's not going to DC, it's not going to the state capital, but it's staying here in the community, and we're going to receive better transit. So whenever we can link taxes and expenditures and explain that to people, I think there's a better chance of being able to increase property tax. But the property tax, as I've tried to explain, is a very complex tax. So whenever you want to increase it, you not only have to plan for that, but you also have to have a continuing sales effort. You have to be constantly explaining to people what they're getting for the tax, why the taxes have gone up, what the impact is going to be. And lastly, there will always be people who need help or need some kind of assistance for their property tax. So when we're increasing property taxes or reforming property taxes, we have to cushion the impact on those who are most vulnerable. And whether it's circuit breakers or tax deferrals, that's fine. Of course, capping and those kinds of assessment and property tax limits cap everybody's taxes. They're not necessarily targeted at those who need the most. And we can do a whole morning on tax and expenditure limits, but that wouldn't be the way to go. So I think the property tax is a good tax for local government. I think there are some obstacles to increasing it, but again, to the extent that we can explain it to people, explain what they're getting for their taxes, I think we can make some progress. Thank you very much.
All right, good morning, everybody. So the suggestion that taxes and expenditures be linked is a really good segue into talking about raising money for transportation infrastructure. So my name is Justin. I manage government affairs and public policy for A Better City. We're a business association that represents institutions and businesses in greater Boston, and we are doing a lot of advocacy and spend a lot of our time trying to raise more revenue for transportation infrastructure, specifically focused on public transit. It's been a lot going on in that world here lately. And I also want to mention that some of the research I'm going to be presenting on case studies around the country was conducted by a great organization that we serve on the advisory board of called Transportation for America. They're a national group that focuses similarly on transportation investment and improvement. So this is just some context. Looking at all the sources of my presentation today is going to mainly focus on public transit, and this is just some context looking at all the sources that fund public transit. So you can see that federal aid is really important. Some of that is reflected in the stimulus funding, even though federal funding faces an uncertain future going forward and support for transit has been declining. The federal government still has a really important role to play in supporting public transit. And you can what I really want to emphasize though is that local governments, both through structured assessments like our MBTA here is partially funded by an assessment on the cities and towns in the service area. Also, through discretionary revenue measures, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more about, local funding, cities and towns are really stepping up to the plate and providing more funding for transit in the wake of uncertain support from states and the federal government. So public transportation ballot measures actually are some of the most successful measures that are out there. There are 309 finance measures on the ballot between 2000 and 2010. 84% of all the transportation measures are finance related. Most of the time that transportation is on the ballot is when a city or town or a county or a regional government is trying to raise money. So that's most of the time that transportation ends up on the ballot. Most of the proposals end up being sales tax increases. Ironically enough, we were just talking about the property taxes. Around the country, it's not always the case, but overall, property tax measures are actually more successful than sales tax measures with an 81% approval rate. And again, part of this has to do with what was previously discussed, the importance of linking what you're getting for your money, and transportation is one of the more concrete ways of doing that. I want to mention that these are pretty optimistic numbers, but they're some context for this, transportation ballot measures are not always for the faint of heart. Often the fourth or fifth time for the same exact proposal is when you end up being successful, and I'll point to an example of that. So again, we have an overall 70% approval rate for transportation ballot measures. I want to talk a little bit about an unsuccessful measure that happened here in Massachusetts. Last November, the recent enactment of indexing to inflation of our state gas tax was repealed, and my organization was very heavily involved with a broad coalition in trying to defend that. One of the problems that we ran into was that it wasn't tied to a specific project. People didn't really understand what they were getting for their money, and they viewed the gas tax as kind of this slush fund, and even though it's constitutionally dedicated to transportation, there were a lot of erroneous claims floating around about how it was going to food stamps and renovating the governor's office and all kinds of crazy things that just weren't accurate. But we had a very hard time pointing out errors with those statements, and the wonderful slogan, taxation without representation, was floating around for a long time, which it had a really good answer, it just wasn't an easy slogan. But again, overall, they're doing quite well, twice the approval rate of all ballot measures, and success across regions, population, and party affiliation. And again, this has to do with tying specific benefits to these increases. So actually, the other point that I want to make is that not all increased local support for transportation is happening via ballot measures. So this was a recent example in Virginia. A new transit line offering increased connections was partially funded through a special district tax on commercial property in the area. And I think the really important and interesting example, or interesting takeaway from this example, is that the diversity in the revenue sources is becoming really important. So local governments are stepping up to the plate, but they're also leveraging federal funds. This project received a significant New Starts grant, and there's also, again, the special district tax. And around the country, this is not true here. Massachusetts cannot do this, but around the country, you're also seeing localities, counties, regional governments make increasing use of toll revenue for transit. The federal law says that toll revenue after bonds have been paid off and if a road is well maintained, you actually are allowed to use some surplus toll revenue for transit. Our state law in Massachusetts doesn't let us do that. So in a lot of ways, Massachusetts is constrained compared to what municipalities and regions are allowed to do around the country. This is a ballot measure. This is in Los Angeles, funding for the Crenshaw Light Rail Line. Again, noting the variety of sources that are being leveraged here. TIFIA is a federal credit program. It's a loan program that's kind of underutilized around the country, but that was leveraged here. Sales tax increase. The other thing that I want to mention about some of these projects is that the sales tax increases are really modest. So I think in most of these cases, it's not even a full %. So it's, again, tied to a specific project that's being put before people, and it's a very modest increase that's being talked about and is helping to leverage other funding. So people are seeing that it's not just their money that is being used for some of these improvements, but it's really leveraging all sorts of additional funding as well. This is an example of a measure that I think took 4 or 5 times to pass successfully. So again, not being for the faint of heart. And you can imagine the amount of money that supporters of this had to raise to go to the ballot 4 or 5 times. And again, it just requires persistence. And eventually, on the 4th or 5th vote, a small, I think it was 0.5% sales tax increase got adopted to fund this. So you can see, though, how even, again, it is modest. It's 0.4, 0.5%, how much dedication and effort and time and resources it takes just to win that level of support. This is a really interesting case study. So Denver is doing one of the most innovative things in the country with its commuter rail program, and it's actually going pretty well, where and ABC actually advocated that the MBTA look at this, but it didn't end up going that direction, at least for now. Denver actually contracted with a private property to completely design and build their commuter rail system, their new commuter rail system, and the parties actually put long-term capital investment into the system. And right now, for the T, our commuter rail is operated by a private party, but it's an 8-year contract. It's not really a long-term deal where the party's putting a lot of money into the capital improvements of the system directly. Here in Denver, there was a long-term 20-year agreement that was put in place, and the private operator had the security to know that they were going to be running the system for a long time, and so they were actually willing to put some money into the design and building the actual system in exchange for that security. And again, there was a 0.5 cent sales tax increase. You can see local funding, but again, private support, New Starts grants. So again, the local government weren't the only people being asked to chip in for this. Again, here are some different examples of ballot measures around the country. So we have 309 ballot measures were being considered nationwide from 2000 to 2010. And you can see the different success rates for different revenue sources. So 84% bonds, 81% property tax, and 59% for the sales tax. So again, it's really important to tailor the solution to the community, and different things work for different places, but these are some of the aggregate results. Again, transportation ballot measures are passing twice at the rate of all ballot measures. And here are some approval rates through the different years. But again, this kind of masks the difficulty, and some of these do take 4 or 5 times to get enacted to begin with. One thing I just want to point out is how people are relying less and less on the gas tax. It's not something that can go away overnight, but it's really, as people are becoming more fuel efficient in their roads, a lot of states actually, people are becoming more fuel efficient, cars are becoming more fuel efficient, people are driving less, but a lot of states actually have restrictions on gas taxes, and thankfully ours here can be used for transit. That's not the case in a lot of other places, but you can see the year that states adopted gas taxes in 1920s for a lot of people, and it's really an important bridge revenue source, but people are looking at more innovative sources, going to the ballot more often for increased local support for projects. And again, this is something that is an obstacle. Nearly everyone, if you ask them, thinks that funding for transportation and the decisions that people make around projects are politically driven. So one of the interesting things in some of these projects that were more successful were a lot of these projects, before people even talked about going to the ballot, were the projects were incorporated into a regional plan. There was a lot of public engagement, so there was a lot of work done ahead of time, a lot of homework to convince people that this was going to be a good investment, lots of community meetings and engagement to have citizens give input into the regional plan. So these projects had been heard about and discussed, and people kind of knew the universe of projects that were being discussed before they went to vote on these things. So doing homework is really important as well. And with that, I'm going to wrap up.
Morning, everyone. Great to be here. Must be a lot of other budget geeks in the room if you're all here for a seminar on fiscal leadership. I thought I would share with you 3 things today. I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'll try and be brief because I really feel there's a tremendous value in the Q&A and the discussion, especially around issues regarding taxation. One is just to share some existing conditions confronting Salem and many other cities, big and small, to try and illustrate some of those challenges directly. And then 3, hopefully to pose some questions about revenue and tax options for further discussion during Q&A. So I know you all have a cognitive map of Salem in your mind, some from a 5th grade field trip, and others maybe who live close by have a better sense. I'll give you some of our stats. We're a small city, 8 square miles, very, very diverse in income levels and backgrounds, always have been. 44,000 population. We host State University, a world-class museum, the largest healthcare institution on the North Shore. We certainly play host to a large event in October around Halloween where we have a lot of folks in town. And frankly, throughout the year, although our population is 44,000, we tend to punch out of our class. We've got this amazing history and we really try and maximize it and take advantage of it. From a budget perspective, that translates into about a $145 million operating budget. And if I gave you a pie chart about our municipal budget, you'd see about 55 to 60% of our revenues come from property taxes, the dreaded property taxes that we've been talking about. About 25% come from state taxes or state revenues, what we typically would call local aid in Massachusetts. And the remainder 20% come from other sources. It might be other local investments in our community, whether they're fees or other revenue sources that come in. The interesting thing in Massachusetts, and those of you here wrestle with this, is we do have property tax limitations called we call it Prop 2.5, started 20-odd years ago, and it really forced communities to be more judicious about our budgeting practices. That means, in real terms, that we can't raise more than 2.5% of last year's property tax levy. That also means we can raise as much new growth as we want. So cities like Salem and many others really have to focus on new growth. How do we bring in those new revenues? What do those new investments look like? For us, we need about $1 million in new growth every year just to pay the freight. And when I say pay the freight, I'll give you an example. So $1 million of new growth for us, that's a decent year. That means we've been working hard, attracting economic investment, putting new development opportunities on the ground and making sure they're happening. That's $1 million in property tax revenues coming in. With our rate about $30 on a commercial tax rate, you can do the math to understand how much actual new investment dollars we need to have happen. If I juxtapose that next to our rising costs, healthcare goes up roughly 2 or 3%. Pensions every year for us is about a $500,000 increase. Just a 1% increase for all of our municipal employees, that's $750,000. If you start to put the math together, you can see $1 million in new growth gets cannibalized pretty quickly by just those rising costs that pretty much are out of our control. Pension, healthcare, wanting to pay a decent and fair wage to your employees. That doesn't take into account new initiatives we might want to undertake, expanded learning time in our schools, or brand new roadway infrastructure improvements. Some of our biggest challenges, being a historic city, are frankly infrastructure, and the amount of, I would say, well-meaning intended policies coming down from the state or federal government that end up on our doorstep. Things like school nutrition. It's great to have more nutritious lunches. It comes at a cost to us. Stormwater regs. Oh, who thought we'd hate stormwater regs? Well, when you have to pay for the cost of maintaining those stormwater regulations, well-meaning policies translate into dollars. And I think for cities, it's a real struggle if we don't have any ability to tap other resources for tax revenues. So a couple of questions that I thought would be worthwhile for us to pose. One is, how do we meet both the needs to improve the quality of life in our communities with state and federal resources really unreliable? It's hard to project on a regular basis what we're going to see coming in. And I think we're a community, we pride ourselves in wanting to do things the right way. We are a GFOA community. We have a Distinguished Budget Award every year. We get our Certificate of Excellence for our CAFRA. We spend time thinking about this. We have actively planned our capital improvements. We're trying to do things right, and it's still a real struggle to figure out how to have a 3-year budget projection actually work out with the rocky road we're on in some ways with state and federal resources. And what's the right balance between local taxation and local autonomies? I'm always struck earlier today listening to the Detroit representative talking about these new autonomies they're looking for. It feels like we get the autonomies after you're bankrupt, as opposed to beforehand to prevent that from happening. And what's the fairest way to spread those state and federal resources and share resources? Salem is diverse. I have poverty challenges. We have more kids who have special needs in comparison to some of our neighbors. Should we get more or less local aid as we wrestle with that? And when we think about that, it brings to my mind 3 kind of key areas to focus on. One is, and I think we wrestle with this as policymakers in Massachusetts and in other places as well, is the current partnership really fair and equitable? The way we divide up the pot of money that comes into the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and distribute that to the 351 cities and towns, do we think that's currently fair? I mean, I look at it and I think, how much money is Salem contributing to the Massachusetts economy? And am I getting my fair share of that? If I was in Boston, I'd probably be really angry, right? I would want to keep all the money. They're generating a lot of the income. Meredith is shaking her head, right? Yes. But I'm in Salem, and I don't know if I like that model then. But I'm not even sure if the current model works, how we divide up the responsibilities. I know that I have to take care of a number of things on the front line, from trash pickup and snow removal and educating kids and making sure we have adequate public safety and making sure we have clean parks and thinking about the future of our growing elderly population and how do we maintain affordable housing. Is the revenue share equal to the responsibilities that happen at the local level? I think we struggle with that as policymakers, and I'm not sure it is. The second area that I think is worthwhile is we are a community collectively able to decide if we want to pay more. There's 2 examples in Salem where we have done just that, and they all came from enabling legislation at the state. And a question that I often ponder is, well, why couldn't we do this on our own? The 2 examples are the Community Preservation Act, the CPA. For those of you in the Commonwealth, you're familiar with it. For those of you who are not, it was an opportunity to add a surcharge to your property tax bills. What residents pay in property taxes to support historic preservation, parks and recreation, and affordable housing. You had to put this measure on the ballot to your voters. We did it twice in Salem. It failed the first time, approximately 5 years ago. Last year, it passed. And we were able to make a very convincing case that this additional cost, roughly $40 for the average resident, was going to go into those wonderful assets that contribute to a high quality of life in our community. Interestingly enough, the city council would not vote to put the question on the ballot. Like, huge fist fight. We're not even going to let people vote about it. We ran around and got signatures in a week, put it on the ballot, and it passed. I think if they had actually put it on the ballot and we just had this sleepy election, people wouldn't have been offended that they couldn't vote on it, and it may not have passed. But just to have the opportunity to have another roughly $750,000 in revenues available for us to spend in those really important quality of life areas, took the legislature passing a bill several years ago and our own residents voting on that, which I think makes a lot of sense. The other way we've been able to increase some revenues is meals taxes and hotel taxes. Again, enabling legislation by the state that said cities and towns will let you have this local option. Those just require a vote of your local legislative body. I wonder, is that the fairest way? I'm in Salem. I'm a tourist community. We have a lot of restaurants. We have a lot of hotels. It works out very well for us. There are communities next door who don't have as much of that. Is that the fairest way for us to allocate resources? I will also say there are communities whose legislative bodies did not want to do this. Raising taxes, residents who didn't necessarily want to pay more for their submarine sandwich or their pizza, and so it didn't move forward. Is that the way we want to allocate resources? It's up to you. I'd love the ability to have a local gas tax that I could put into my roads. Ask my residents, would you mind if we had some kind of a surcharge on gas tax here, and we will help improve local roads? Because I know right now I need $15 million to get every road in the city of Salem up to a state of good repair. I don't have the authority to do that. There's some interesting discussions going on about that. Should that be a local option in places? Maybe not a gas tax, but some other sort of revenue source locally, and I'm intrigued by that. I would say the last thing is, how do we as cities meet performance standards, or should we have to? There are 351 cities and towns. I think there are 40 cities that have mayors. There are city managers. There are town managers. There are boards of selectmen. We govern very differently. We don't have a strong county seat in Massachusetts any longer. We bring different skill sets to the job of managing local cities. I worked in the city of Chelsea where there was a city manager. I happen to feel like that's the Cadillac. I kind of approach my job as a mayor in that way. But do we reward good behavior? Should we penalize bad behavior? And by that I mean institutionalize bad habits. There are examples of countless cities, a handful I would say, of communities that aren't well managed, that don't follow GFOA practices, that have had people who have squandered opportunities, yet they tend to get a large sum of state dollars every year and don't necessarily have that direct accountability because 90% of your schools are funded by the state, or a large sum of dollars comes in. Is that the fairest way to do that? And how do we want to untangle those knots? Getting back to the Detroit example, where we tend to allow for those autonomies and create those flexibilities when the truck is in the ditch, as opposed to, it would be really great to be able to have some of those tools available to managers now to prevent the truck from going into the ditch. So these are the sorts of things that we struggle with on the local level. I'm excited by some of the discussions that we've had in the state, but I also know it takes an awful long time, not just in Massachusetts, I'm sure this is everywhere, to get to the point where we actually have those tools in the toolbox that I can use. I think most of my colleagues very much feel like we're on our own. There are things coming down the pike that we need to be preparing for, whether it's climate change or a global economy that we have to educate our kids differently. We'll have some guidance from the state. More often than not, it feels like they're in the way and not necessarily providing us help and partnership. I think there's a strong desire to do that, but there's lots of collective differences of opinions about how to do that. Simple things like more liquor licenses to help investment become really complicated and hard topics in Massachusetts. And I think audiences like this and opportunities to influence policymakers are the only way we're actually going to be able to illustrate what those challenges are and hopefully put out reasonable solutions that can be accommodated in a short time frame. So I look forward to the discussion, and thanks for the opportunity to come before you.
Time for your questions. I'll lead off, if I may, with a question for the panel. And this is a contextual question. As you know, state and local taxes, by and large, are deductible for federal income tax purposes. If you're at a 25% marginal rate at the federal income tax, your real property tax is only costing you 75% of the stated amount that you see on the bill. To what extent is that relevant or important in whether you can raise taxes, and to what extent should you worry about the discussions that happen from time to time in Washington about repealing or limiting the deduction for state and local taxes?
Everyone's looking at me. So it is a regressive measure to allow property tax deductibility from income for income tax purposes. We do not allow that in Canada. I don't think it's a very good idea. But you're asking the question, does it make it more palatable to pay the property tax. And I'm guessing no. I'm guessing there's still a very visible property tax, and that the property tax deductibility feels more like an income tax measure and less like a property tax measure. And strangely enough, it's not always the low-income people who complain about their property taxes going up. They're not often the ones who use the word regressivity. It's usually the middle-income people and the high-income people who say the property tax is regressive, and therefore we should get rid of it. But I don't think property tax deductibility. I guess we are being recorded, and now I'm going to be thrown out of the country. but I don't think it's a very good idea, largely because it's regressive.
Thank you.
I think we have two pieces of evidence on this question. So in the 1980s, the tax code was changed to eliminate the deductibility for sales taxes at the state level. And I think the evidence, at least the evidence I'm familiar with, shows that there really wasn't a huge change in behavior in people's willingness to increase sales taxes. And I think another example is I showed you the California crisis in 2009. And one of the ways the state decided to deal with that crisis is the head of the state Senate came up with this crazy tax plan whereby the state income taxes would go up, but they would go up in such a way that the deductibility of the federal level would offset it so that nobody would actually have to pay more. The state would get more, the federal government would get less. And it was so complicated, and nobody understood it at all, that it basically went down in defeat. Because I think of the salience issue, even though it's deductible, people have no idea how this actually works and the mechanics.
Okay, questions from the audience? Question back there.
Hey, Vladimir, is that right? So you gave us this great set of slides that showed the impact of what happens when the overrides don't work, or whatever we call them. What happens when they do work? Did you do a similar study that showed the change?
So yeah, it's a good question. So the evidence I showed you is kind of the difference between areas where they do work and areas where they don't. It's driven mostly by areas where they don't, because again, there's essentially a spending cut because costs are growing, healthcare costs are growing, salaries are growing. So if your revenue isn't going up, you can't keep up with those. But it's a good question of sort of how much of this difference in student achievement is driven by the cuts versus the extra services that the school districts can offer when their levies do pass. That's a very good question.
Other questions?
I'll ask a second.
Yes. Microphone?
So I'm curious about how the quality of services in an area affects both the impact of cutbacks and the propensity of voters to, say, pass tax increases. And so thinking about that specifically with the presentations that you guys did, for Vlad, do you find that when levy overrides fail, is this worse in places where the school spending is already low? Do you find heterogeneous effects depending upon sort of what prior levels of spending are in a district? And then just start thinking about transportation. Do you find that those kinds of transportation funding increases are going to be easier to pass in places where the transit system is functional? Like thinking about our winter here in Massachusetts, I would imagine that voters would be very hard pressed right now to want to give the MBTA more money, given what we've just learned about sort of some of the inefficiencies in the system. So yeah, just sort of thinking about both those issues.
So I'll answer that first question. I think there's very good evidence that voter behavior is very much driven by their perceived quality of services. And in education, I think that's particularly problematic because the way we measure the quality is usually how well students do and their achievement levels. And only a small part of that is actually determined by the quality of their school district versus their socioeconomic status or whether they're an English learner, whether their parents' education level. And so because of that, and because voters are making these decisions, essentially what you see over time is that the high-performing suburban school districts get more money because it's easier to pass these school levies because schools look really good. And the urban districts have a much harder time, and so over time the gap only grows. The gap in school quality only grows for that reason.
So on transportation, I'm going to give a nuanced answer to your question. I think so I'll talk about what happened last fall and then what happened this winter. But last fall with the gas tax vote, I think one of the most challenging things was that it was a system-wide, statewide vote, and people's experience with the system was so diffuse. Some people were drivers and road users, and people were people's feelings about the gas tax in Springfield and Worcester were very different than how people felt about it in Boston, and people's feelings about whether their communities were being well invested in were very wide-ranging. And so that was one of the difficulties. I would say generally in our research, one of the things that we found is that I think having it be well run is very important and well managed, but when people really felt that it was localized, the more localized the measure was, the better it tended to do, and the more it was linked with a specific improvement. As far as the T goes and what happened this winter, we're actually in the middle of doing some public opinion research now, but I would give people a little more credit in the sense that I think there's a recognition that definitely some management reforms are needed, but that people also realize that the system has been underinvested in for a long time. If just in some of the early results we've gotten, we asked people what they thought about the free day that the T recently had, and some of the reaction we got was, why are we having a free day when the system needs so much money? So people were actually, I think people are making the link between what happened this winter and how old the system is, and there are management improvements that need to be made for sure, and that has to be part of the conversation, but I also give people credit, and I think they realize that investment has to be part of the solution as well.
Other questions? Yes.
My question's for the mayor. You talked a lot about the city and the state. Two questions. One, how about the regional planning, transport, economic development agencies? Are those worthwhile or window dressing? And two, is regionalism part of the solution to some of the problems that cities and towns face?
Yeah, two really good questions. I think our regional organization, MAPC, does a great job, and I probably would have answered this question differently maybe 25 years ago, but they've really found, I think, a good niche from a collective advocacy perspective, and also delivering technical expertise and making it easy to have regional connections, whether it's regional purchasing or other areas where we're trying to focus. I'm a big believer in regionalism. I actually grew up in Florida, so I'm used to very much a county system, and having the difficulty of trying to do things like put together health departments from neighboring communities, same state sanitary code, and not even from a perspective of necessarily saving large dollars, but having a much more productive organizations that could focus on not only inspections but prevention. Super hard. Been burned a couple of times trying to make that happen, and just completely, I would say, under-anticipated the level of connection that people have, or feeling that people have, that somebody from another community isn't going to care about my community in an area like public health, where I eat in restaurants next door, they eat in restaurants here. There's got to be a shared way to make that happen. It's a real struggle in Massachusetts to find those links and connections. When there are leaders at the local level that want to do this and embrace it, it works well. Bringing people together by dragging heirs to whatever the initiative is, it seems to really be destined for failure. So I do think the regional planning agencies actually help with those discussions and those dialogues, and can provide that technical expertise to show, well, here's what the new organization would look like, here's what the savings would be, or here's what the opportunities are to gain ground in a particular area. But we do not do that enough at all.
Other questions? Yes.
Mine is more comment, I think, than question, although it might spark. Every time I'm listening to all this, I keep hearing the why. Why did a measure not pass? What was we understand that things do pass or they don't, but what's the why? Is it because we sometimes have a poor message? We're not articulating our message across, that why we need this money? And I think that's part of the reason we had an issue with the transportation bill. Is it a poor management perception? The constituents don't believe that we're managing well, therefore they're not going to want to throw more money at a solution. And I think that's also part of the transportation issue. And I think we have a hard time presenting creative solutions to why we need more money, and all we keep asking the taxpayer is to throw more money at something because there's a hole in the well and we need to fill it up.
Sure. So I think I agree with everything you just said. One of the, ABC is very nonpartisan, so I don't want to get in any trouble. But one of the issues that we had with the gas tax last fall was we actually identified what we thought was a very strong message around public safety that really resonated across the state, road and bridge safety in particular, talking about how many bridges and roads across the state were falling apart, and we ran some ads that we thought were going to be very successful with that. We unfortunately had our issue tied up in the governor's race last year, where the Republican Governors Association decided to make 70% of their ad spending ads that attacked the Democratic candidate for her support of the gas tax or not knowing what the gas tax was, and that certainly wasn't helpful in terms of our message really cutting through the political clutter. We were trying to push a very nonpartisan message around public safety, and that kind of got muddled with what was going on in the governor's race. I would say, again, to go back to management, restoring trust in the system and that projects are being pursued through not just a political lens is really important. One of the things in Massachusetts that is going on right now is the Secretary of Transportation is under the direction of the legislature pursuing what's called project selection criteria. So there would be a more quantitative, publicly available metric system for how projects are prioritized throughout the state, not just MBTA projects, but road and bridge projects as well. And so that's something that's really important for giving people a sense of why money is going where it is. And then obviously looking at governance and management issues throughout the system. There was work done in 2009, but there's obviously more work to do.
So I'll just jump in very quickly. I think it comes down to the second word in the title of the conference, which is leadership. And I think we have really good evidence that voters do follow the cues of their political elites. So when the mayor comes out and says, we really need a tax increase to pay for these vital services, there's going to be a lot more voters who voted for that mayor that change their mind and say, I think the mayor is right, than the voters who kind of vote for somebody else because they're upset. And I think a big problem is that we have a lot of candidates that run for office, whether they're incumbents or most likely challengers, saying, you don't need more revenues, you just need to vote for me because I have these magical leadership skills and I will give you all the services that you want without you needing to pay anything for them. And I think the other part of that is also how we talk about these issues. And I think a great example is yesterday from the discussion of OPEB, of the retirement benefits. We had two guest speakers on the panel that, in talking about these unfunded liabilities, both mentioned that, here in Massachusetts, you get a lifetime health care if you're a part-time employee that works for 10 years. And that may be true, but my guess would be that the amount of the liability due to these employees is actually pretty small. But when we talk about the issues in that way, right, and you're a voter, you come away with the conclusion that we're paying hundreds of millions of dollars for employees that worked for part-time for 10 years. And I think how these problems are defined really has a huge effect on how constituents think about, whether it's worth paying more for the services that they're getting.
We have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
This is a question from someone who's been in the public and private sector for the last 40 years. And first to the academics. I have sat through these for a long time and have even dabbled in academics a bit myself, and I'm sure Shelley will give a good presentation on this. But, the question that constantly comes to mind is compared to what? In other words, the analysis that The Ohio State University has to provide this morning is of the current situation. For part of my life, I was the CFO of a Fortune 100 company. And you would always look at what are the alternatives compared to what? And the mayor may ask the question, what could a city look like? Shouldn't we be tempting ourselves with the use of new technologies, new ways of building buildings, new ways entirely of dealing with transportation, safety, water? They're all out there. The private sector is using all this stuff constantly to retool plants. Michigan, for example, is deeply into this in terms of the way that General Motors has retooled almost everything they do, with the result being a reduction in the cost of goods sold, primarily because they have figured out how to do things cheaper, better, faster. Wouldn't it help if the academy was now sort of tempting us with ways in which we could be doing things cheaper, better, faster, rather than dealing with old-fashioned tax incidence analysis? I'll leave that out there.
I guess I would offer one editorial to that, and that is I do think it is the job of mayors in particular, to approach the work that we do in sort of 3 buckets. One being, how do we make sure the work that has to get done every day gets done, whether it's picking up trash or plowing snow or just making the trains run on time. And 2 is, where is the continuous improvement? We're always looking to be more efficient, more progressive, using technology in a way that changes how we do things. We don't pick up trash the way we did 20 years ago. We don't police the way we did 20 years ago. We are embracing that. And we need to have leaders, not just mayors, but senior staff within our organizations that are always looking for continuous improvement. And then the last category is, what are those really important breakout ideas, those innovations, turning, in our case, a power plant into a cruise port? You know, what's going to be the vision setting that's going to guide us down the road? I think that's the approach. And you know this from your work. Not every local leader looks at the job that way. Everybody comes with different skill sets. There are folks who make a living off of, let's make sure no pots boil over. You know, that's going to get me reelected, and that's going to be okay. And there are others that are risk takers who, you know, end up there a long time because that leadership is welcomed, or, you know, take those risks and they don't work out. But the idea of, I think, local leaders being stewards is really important to have that approach. Somebody else is going to be sitting in my seat at some point, and somebody else sat before me. And the approach to that job and that leadership is critical, and it varies from place to place.
We have to do everything as academics. You know, we can't just focus on one thing. But you're right. I mean, I said yesterday, finance follows function. We have to start with, what kind of city do we want? What does it look like? What services do we provide? At what level do we provide them? And then we have to figure out how to pay for it. So this panel was how to pay for it. I believe there's a panel, if I can advertise, at 12:50 on the efficient city, which is talking about technological improvements and those kinds of things. I personally wouldn't be able to speak on that panel because I'm a public finance tax person, but I think you have to do both. I mean, I think we have to look at the city we want, how we're going to deliver services. And cities are using new technologies and data analytics, and all kinds of things are happening out there. But we still, at the end of the day, have to figure out how we're going to pay for those services, however we provide them.
Thank you very much.